Hello and welcome. Today we're going to look at the fatal consequences of a misplaced metaphor, the agricultural industry and the delusion of infinite growth in a finite ecosystem. Our problem is the phrase agricultural industry. In fact, agriculture and industry are quite different things. And it's a misplaced metaphor to suggest that agriculture is part of industry. In fact, it's quite separate and has to run on different principles. So the misplaced metaphor is agricultural industry itself. The problem of a misplaced metaphor becomes very apparent when we consider how we should behave as a species in a complex ecosystem. Broadly speaking, there are two approaches. There is an ethic of sustainability, with all that entails for behavior, and an ethic of continuous growth, based on continued growthism, that is the belief in continuous growth, and business as usual in our culture. In fact, this would require no change in belief. That's what our culture has come to believe. But this is what's problematic. Continued growthism, that is the belief that growth can be and should be continuous, has become the basic ideology of most nation-state economies in the modern world. It, in effect, is the logic in growth economics of business as usual. The trouble is that we're beginning to realize that these assumptions are based on ignorance and arrogance and lead inevitably to overshoot and collapse. The reason why we've worked on these assumptions, however, has to do with the 500 years of European colonialism and its legacy in our mindset. We've come to discuss this in other contexts, but you've seen the different components of it, particularly the myth of racial exceptionalism, the notion that some races are set apart from others and usually thought to be superior. It needn't just be racial, it could be cultural exceptionalism or religious exceptionalism, the bounding off of one community from the rest of the world and thinking of it as exceptions to the rule, exceptions to the other forms of being human. The second dominant myth emerging from European colonialism is that of the frontier myth and the ensuing illusion of economies of perpetual growth. The third component is the myth of techno-scientific salvationism, which really takes over from the frontier with the help of industrialization. At the point that frontiers become exhausted and there are no more frontiers at the end of the 19th century, the emergence of industrialization is introduced as a kind of salvation, a kind of techno-scientific salvationism, which allows many in the frontier cultures to believe that continuous growth is possible well beyond the existence of any real frontier. It can take place in the continuous growth of industrial civilizations. This then is what we're going to focus on because it's the centerpiece of the illusion that gives rise to the mixed metaphor, misplaced metaphor of agricultural industry. It's the frontier myth and ensuing illusion of the economies of perpetual growth. It comes from people like Cecil Rhodes, but also many more. In fact, the whole European colonial tradition out of the 19th century. Basically, Europeans expanded upon the things of nature, and in the process they came to believe that expansion was in the nature of things. It was just natural. It was assumed to be a kind of natural law. But in a finite ecosystem, continuous expansion of any one population cannot happen. It cannot exist. In fact, the expansion of one population in an ecosystem leads to overshoot of that population and its collapse. And in the process, usually the destruction of the ecosystem of which it's a part. But enduring myths based on these misplaced metaphors can dramatically accelerate the society's collapse. And this is what we're beginning to see nowadays. Continued growthism and the presumption that we can move ahead with business as usual with no change in our beliefs entails inevitably an overshoot and collapse scenario where human populations and their consumptive patterns overshoot the carrying capacity of the ecosystem in which they exist, and soon thereafter collapse. An ethic of sustainability, on the other hand, would mean that human populations ultimately recognize the limits of a declining carrying capacity and subordinate their own population reproduction and their patterns of consumption to well below an enduringly sustainable level of ecosystem capacity. This would demand major cultural change in our own tradition since we've become so used to continuous growthism. This is very worrisome at this point because experts tell us that, in fact, agriculture is at a crossroads. That's the, in fact, lead of their headline on the issue. And they pointed to it in a series of questions. Why should 688 million people on our planet be going hungry while 1.9 billion are suffering from the ill effects of overweight and obesity? In 2019, more grain was harvested than ever before, 27 billion tons worldwide. Despite this record-breaking harvest, only 43% was used to feed people. The rest was used to feed livestock, fill our petroleum tanks of our cars and SUVs, support industrial production processes, or was simply wasted. Our global food system is one of the most significant contributors to climate change, biodiversity loss, pollution, and water shortages, as well as preventable disease, poverty, and injustice. This is what moves these analysts to say that business as usual is not an option. If we continue in this direction, we will not survive. That's why agriculture is at a crossroads. It's unsustainable in its current trajectory. The transformation of our food systems have been fairly recent, within the last 100 years, in fact, within only the last 70 years on a global basis. And it's had to do with making a shift in the paradigm. The shift has been from thinking of agriculture as an aspect of biology and humans' interaction with the biological world to thinking of agriculture as an industrial process, now made possible through mechanical production and petro-intensive forms of motorization and mechanization. In reality, historians have pointed out that the whole of world agriculture has changed more in the last 70 years than it did over the period of the previous 7,000 years of human history. That's a radical transformation, a paradigm shift in a very short period of time. basically 1/100th of the period in which the whole system has been shifted from biology to industrial process. It has changed so much that many politicians and the public at large think of it now as an industry, because large agro-industrial firms have come to dominate it throughout the world. Take the example, for example, of Whole Foods, founded by John Mackey not long ago. He was a bit of an idealist and wanted to produce food that was nutritious and deliver it to greater and greater numbers of humans, in urban populations in particular. In the process, with all the virtues that he, in fact, personified as a vegan, wanting to do good work with wholesome food to distribute to masses of people, he ended up becoming a very big CEO, chief executive officer of Whole Foods, and eventually sold Whole Foods to Amazon for $13.7 billion. You could say that he embraced the idea of a biologically based system, but in effect, he was functioning in a capital-controlled environment to such an extent that he sold out to the biggest monopoly on the Earth's surface. He was questioned about this by students, and it's worth listening to the exchange because it reveals a great deal about how he thinks he has intervened in creating value for Whole Foods. At the same time, it highlights the fact that he's really just become a subset of industrial process. Let's take a look.
My name is Eva Berry, and I guess my question is specifically to you, Mr. Mackey. Arguably, very arguably, you deserve to make more money than like the people who work at your checkout lines as the CEO of Whole Foods. But do you really think that the gap of pay between you and your workers is really justified? Do you think it could?
I absolutely don't. There is a huge gap between what I get paid and what the team members at Whole Foods get paid. I make $1 a year, and I have for the last 13 years. All my stock options were donated also to our 3 foundations, to End Poverty, School Nutrition Gardens, and to whole cities, the inner cities. So it's a pretty big gap, but I can afford it.
You have a great imagination.
Thank you.
You've accomplished so much, and you're so fair in what you're doing with your own wealth. Are you comfortable with what other CEOs are doing, or can't you imagine something better for society?
So that's a good lead-in to the world's evolving. Consciousness is evolving. And I wrote a book, Conscious Capitalism. I brought 250 copies here. I'm not selling them to you. As a good capitalist would, I'm going to give them to you. So make sure you grab one on the way out. So the world is changing. The Business Roundtable just adopted basic conscious capitalism principles and announced them publicly. Capitalism is evolving, and it has the potential for higher purpose. It has the potential to create value for all the stakeholders. It has the potential to create organizations where human beings can flourish at higher levels. It has the ability to create leaders that are servant leaders. That's what I've done with my business for the past 42 years, and others are doing it as well. So if you go to consciouscapitalism.org, you will find there's a whole movement for this. That's my answer to that question.
Richard Wolff. A simple arithmetic. John decided to take the millions or billions, I'm not sure, that he could have taken, like most CEOs do. He decided not to, and he decided to do something else with it. His personal decision. His alternative, if he didn't want to get paid all that money, would have been to lower the prices at Whole Foods, and everybody else would have saved the money that he is not taking anyway, and that would have distributed much more democratically what it is he chose not to take. When you distribute income and wealth in a highly unequal manner, so that some people get the vast bulk and the rest of us don't, you're leaving the power of the purchasing overwhelmingly in the hands of a minority that shapes what gets produced. That's the question of whether you are free or not, to use their language, or you live in a society that skews who gets produced What gets produced? Because you're giving a disproportionate amount of the income to a tiny portion of your population.
That would be true if we had a monopoly, but we don't. People can shop wherever they want to. That's capitalism. There's competition.
You sold your company to a monopoly. You know that.
Yes, you sold your company to a monopoly for $13.7 billion. Very good. Is that free competition? Not quite. John Mackey, think it over a bit. What has been the impact of your development as CEO of the Whole Foods enterprise? It's become an industry within what we think of as a profit-producing system of returns to capital. Mackey went on, of course, and emphasized that the merger with Amazon enabled long-term thinking. This is really quite priceless. Long-term thinking. Really? This would be great. But historically, what kind of long-term framework has characterized the thinking of capitalists? Quarterly performance of stock, yearly performance and profitability, perhaps decades in the case of people like this with a vision. What about centuries, though? What about millennia? Are the agricultural systems being put in place by those who control this kind of capital thinking about the survival of the ecosystem over millennia? This is a real problem for all of us, because there is a destructive power of enduring myths of growth in modern civilizations. There is something known very clearly to all economists as uneconomic growth. And yet some people, furnished in their minds in high school with dreams of continuous growth, are in fact pushing forward with those dreams despite all of what science is screaming to us about the collapse of natural ecosystems, the threat of record hurricanes and severe weather, and the emergence of resurgent global viruses that we haven't at all any response to. Nevertheless, the high school dreams persist. And Bezos is a supreme example of this. He's the richest man on earth, characterized by both ignorance and arrogance, looking forward to what he's created himself called Blue Moon. So it turns out October's a blue moon month, the only month this year that has 2 full moons within it. The second one is known as a blue moon. Let's look for a minute, though, at what this implies. It's really quite staggering, this blue moon. And the image is something that calls upon a frontier past and the mythology of continuous growth, and driven by what he has become, the king of consumerism. Let's take a look.
Jeff Bezos has already conquered the retail frontier. Now he's got a plan to colonize the planet.
Bezos is laying out his plans for colonizing space.
Bezos is known for going big, and now he's literally shooting for the moon.
In May of 2019, Jeff Bezos, the richest person on the planet, unveiled his latest invention.
This is Blue Moon. It's time to go back to the moon, this time to stay.
Jeff has said over and over again that the most important work he's doing is work in space. What he's built with Amazon is really important and really interesting, and it's revolutionized commerce. But it's only revolutionized commerce.
Bezos' plan is to chart a new course for the future of humanity.
Manufactured worlds.
Okay, you hear it there, straight from his own statement, manufactured worlds.
Rotated to create artificial gravity with centrifugal force. These are very large structures, miles on end, and they hold 1 million people or more each.
These manufactured worlds hold 1 million people or more each. This is his vision for the future. He's got fancy, illustrative indications of it that would make anybody in the movie industry quite jealous. Take a look. It's really quite staggering.
Very large structures, miles on end, and they hold 1 million people or more each.
It's an idea he's had since he was a teenager.
This is me in high school, and I want to highlight this quote. The Earth is finite, and if the world economy and population is to keep expanding, space is the only way to go. I still believe that.
The way Jeff Bezos sees it is that consumerism is an example of how today's society lives better than our parents did and our grandparents. And he wants, future generations to continue to have an increasingly better lifestyle.
These are beautiful. People are going to want to live here.
Bezos unveiled his extraterrestrial plans at a time of growing concern about the empire he's built here on Earth.
Right. The empire he's built here on Earth. Well, we also need to examine in depth the misplaced metaphors in Jeff Bezos's concept of agriculture, which he seems to have put on these models in animations circulating around the Earth in fact, these large animations based on his high school dreams. But what does he know about agriculture? He thinks it can be subsumed as a part of his manufactured worlds, as if you can have tractors and farms and crops growing in midair. Well, this is the kind of basic metaphor he's brought to the combination of his power now, his industrial logic applied to Whole Foods, which he's now bought. And John Mackey and Jeff Bezos are referred to and refer to themselves as a meeting of souls. They see real potential here. But ask yourself, why Amazon is buying Whole Foods? Think about it for a while, from a business point of view.
Huge news that could change the way you shop for food. Amazon is buying organic grocery giant Whole Foods for $13.7 billion. Now, how is this going to change the Whole Foods experience? What if you're not an Amazon Prime customer? Can I still go to Whole Foods stores and buy my weekly dose of quinoa? Yes, Amazon is not planning to shut down any of the brick and mortar retailers. Whole Foods obviously has struggled in the past couple of years making this a deal that made sense for them. The reputation of it being whole paycheck, concerns about them having exorbitantly high prices. Remember the whole asparagus water thing? John Oliver had a field day with that one.
$6?
Now Whole Foods doesn't have to worry about how its stock is going to react when late night comedians bash it. That's Jeff Bezos' problem. Amazon is clearly experimenting with how it wants to rule retail. It has a physical bookstore, for example. It has Amazon Fresh, which delivers food to you, but you can also, quote unquote, click and collect, go and pick up something that you ordered online. Amazon is even experimenting with its own food store in its hometown of Seattle with no cash registers. So this is going to be interesting to see whether or not Jeff Bezos can transform the grocery business the way he has done other aspects of retail and even media. Other supermarkets, though, they are in a world of pain on this news. Kroger, Target, Walmart even, their shares are plunging, Costco too. The key to this deal is it shows the genius of Jeff Bezos. Of course, it's too soon to say whether or not buying Whole Foods for this amount of money will be a success, but keep in mind, no one was even speculating that this deal was going to happen. It was kept under wraps. This just goes to show that Bezos is thinking about things that no one else on the planet is even considering.
Right. Bezos is thinking about things that no one else on the planet is even considering. This may be part of the problem, because we have to ask ourselves, in fact, if this is the case, what is going to happen to the whole of the food industry as it becomes more and more subsumed under the industry rather than the biology of agricultural production. Given the power over the human food supply of the largest corporations on earth, we need to examine Bezos's concept of agriculture in great detail. Social scientists have long observed that our behavior is largely determined by the metaphors we live by. What are the metaphors Bezos lives by? Can humanity survive a misplaced metaphor that governs the behavior of the richest man on earth? It's built on a very fanciful notion of the way ecosystems work. In fact, it's totally out to lunch. He has no idea how ecosystems work, and it's very apparent. They're treated as if they're mechanical, manufactured items. Let's look.
It's an idea he's had since he was a teenager.
This is me in high school, and I want to highlight this quote: "The Earth is finite, and if the world economy and population is to keep expanding, space is the only way to go." I still believe that.
The way Jeff Bezos sees it is that consumerism is an example of how today's society lives better than our parents did and our grandparents, and he wants, future generations to continue to have an increasingly better lifestyle.
These are beautiful. People are going to want to live here.
It's pretty staggering. His manufactured environments, he says, are beautiful. People are going to want to live here. It's so staggering, we've got to listen to it again. Take a look. It's really quite amazing.
It's an idea he's had since he was a teenager.
This is me in high school, and I want to highlight this quote: "The Earth is finite, and if the world economy and population is to keep expanding, space is the only way to go." I still believe that.
The way Jeff Bezos sees it is that consumerism is an example of how today's society lives better than our parents did and our grandparents, and he wants, future generations to continue to have an increasingly better lifestyle.
These are beautiful. People are going to want to live here.
The way Jeff Bezos sees it is that consumerism is an example of how today's society lives better than our parents did and our grandparents, and he wants, future generations to continue to have an increasingly better lifestyle.
This is me in high school, and I want to highlight this quote.
Okay, now here he's taking quite some pride in his high school insights. This is me in high school, as he says, and it's from a yearbook or some internal publication, perhaps a newspaper, who knows, from his high school. But he wants to highlight this quote for us all. It's really quite extraordinary.
"The Earth is finite, and if the world economy and population is to keep expanding, space is the only way to go."
Now, this is fascinating. It's an if-then proposition. If the world economy and population is to keep expanding, then, obviously, space is the only way to go. Why? Well, because the Earth is finite and infinite growth has to go out into space. He never questions the premise. If the world economy and population is to keep expanding, Well, maybe it can't. That is never raised in his mind because he has not a basic understanding of biology. No population can expand infinitely in an ecosystem. Can't happen, won't happen. But he dealt with all of his fantasizing on his part as if it were a mechanical dream, not a biological reality.
I still believe that.
Well, that's the problem. He still believes in a world that has no reality in biology. If the Earth is finite, and if the world economy and population is to keep expanding, space is the only way to go. I still believe that, he says. I still believe that. He says this in May of 2019. Trouble with this is that it's dead wrong in any living system. And in our circumstance, we need to ask a lot of questions of Jeff Bezos and all those who believe in the continuous expansion of consumer society. He is, it must be admitted, the king of consumerism. But what makes him think that consumerism has any future at all on a finite planet? Well, he's obviously concluded that it probably doesn't, so we have to go off into space. Staggering unreality for a cultural icon of ours. The reason is that the disasters caused by the expansion of consumerism and growthism are now apparent to everyone, whether it's the forests burning in California or the almost continent-wide burning in Australia last year, rising sea levels, increasing hurricanes, and increasingly severe hurricanes. It takes a monumental effort to ignore reality, to pretend that growthism can continue. The disasters that have been caused by the expansion of consumerism and growthism are on all sides and can't be ignored. Reports come out continuously, including those highlighted in newspapers like The Guardian. Humans exploiting and destroying nature on an unprecedented scale, says the report. Or, for that matter, wildlife in catastrophic decline, according to the BBC, due to human destruction, scientists warn. It's really staggering. These are reports from the last few months, not years, months. In our ignorance and arrogance as a species, we have exceeded the limits of our own eco-niche within the ecosystem. This could lead to our rapid extinction. We're not in charge of an ecosystem. No one organism is in charge of an ecosystem. This is a truism to any biologist who recognizes that no ecosystem can be dominated by one species. It ceases then to function as a system and collapses.
Scientists, of course, have known about this interdependence for years, and indeed decades, and they've been warning us about this. And now the BBC has made a film about our ecological interdependence with the world's greatest naturalist, Sir David Attenborough. If you live in a country where you can get access to this film, definitely make the effort to see it. It's a very important encapsulation. And as they say, David Attenborough has a warning.
The unprecedented impact we are having on the planet is not only putting the ecosystems we rely on at risk. Scientists scientists believe that our destructive relationship with nature is actually putting us at greater risk of pandemic diseases.
We've seen an increasing rate of pandemic emergence. We've had swine flu, SARS, Ebola, and we've actually looked back over every emerging disease and said, where did it originate on the planet? And what are the things going on there that could have caused it? And we found we're behind every single pandemic, and it's human impact on the environment that drives emerging diseases.
Yes, human impact on the environment. In part, we're bringing wildlife into our world with great use of wet markets, bringing things like snakes, bats, rodents of all kinds into wildlife markets. Secondly, we're intruding into wildlife habitats through deforestation and logging and the clearing of land for agriculture, particularly for the production of beef. 31% of all emerging diseases, they've estimated, have had their origins in this land use change, transformations of forests to grasslands for vegetation to support export beef. It's become quite dramatic in South America, but it's prevalent everywhere in the world. Larger and larger areas of the land are cleared to make way for grazing cattle. Our consumption of beef and our consumption of poultry and poultry products drives the global intrusion upon the natural habitats of other species and generates novel viruses that jump to humans, sometimes through our domesticated animals. In short, the global expansion of industrial models of production in agriculture and meat production is the source of pandemics that can kill millions, in fact, tens of millions of humans, with ever-increasing frequency. Scientists have been pointing this out for more than 20 years. Gentlemen like this have made the warning very clear.
It's my view that it's our relationship with nature and the way we interact with it that drove the emergence of COVID.
We've been changing biodiversity in really critical ways that made this more likely to happen.
And the warning then comes very clearly: if we do not change our way of proceeding, if we continue on our current pathway, this coronavirus pandemic might not be a one-off event.
If we continue on our current pathway, then what we've experienced this year might not be a one-off event.
So says Sir David Attenborough. And the scientists back him up with very chilling statistics and estimates.
We estimate there are going to be 5 new emerging diseases affecting people every year. We cannot live with that and the rate at which they're increasing and crashing our economies. If we have one of these every decade, we cannot persist with that level.
We cannot persist with that level. That's not just the doctors. That's not just the British. It's not just the Americans. It's the human species cannot persist with those levels of infestation from new and unknown diseases. Look how long it's taking to develop a COVID-19 vaccine. If we have these once a year, we're in trouble. We're now witnessing a global second wave in this particular
pandemic, which is a coronavirus related to SARS. In fact, it's referred to scientifically as SARS coronavirus 2. And it shows up as COVID-19, coronavirus 19, because it's in the year 2019 that it became identified. Well, what about COVID-20, COVID-21A, COVID-21B, that are likely to be coming down the pike because of the way they interact in animal populations and jump to human populations? On one level, there's now a kind of new realism setting in. The sad and sobering reality is that there will be no post-coronavirus moment ahead. Viruses can mutate or migrate or switch host populations within an ecosystem as a whole, but they do never go away. They change their character much faster than we can catch up as medical scientists. The reason is simply this: viruses get their R&D, research and development, as it were, for free. We have to pay for ours. Viruses can bankrupt the human population. Just look at the impact, the economic impact of this one virus that became a pandemic around the world. But high school ignorance and monumental arrogance persists. It's just staggering when you look at it in reference to thinking that agriculture can be placed in these extraterrestrial modules to function as it does on Earth. Can't happen, won't happen. Why? Because agriculture is a complex ecosystem process that involves both weather and soils, neither of which Bezos seems to be aware of, being focused on exponential growth of machines. But if you look at agroecosystems and the way they interact with climate change, we have a very tough problem ahead, even on Earth. For 32 years, ever since Jim Hansen in front of the Senate made it clear that climate change is here to stay and giving very worrisome signals to us as a human community, we should be very worried for these last 32 years, and the human population has not caught up to his insights. It's important to remember that his insights about climate had direct and immediate implications for how we live in reference to our own food supply.
We do remember that there was an impressive panel of scientists giving Senate testimony back in 1988, congressional hearings on climate change. And it was quite a panel. Sir, in that panel was Jim Hansen himself. And he's often given credit for, in effect, saying the greenhouse effect is real and it's causing global warming now. He states this very clearly on the 23rd of June, 1988. In the same year, in a different part of town, and in fact to a different Senate panel, other points were made. But before we leave this one, we ought to remember that another major voice on that panel was right here from the Boston area. Professor William Muma, who's taught since then at Tufts University and created a whole program on international resources and the environment. He's just retired, and he's just about to give the commencement address to the sustainability graduating class at the Harvard Extension School. he's worth hearing if you can get the chance to get into that commencement ceremony.
There were others on that panel with Jim Hansen. In fact, they're kind of who's who of climate science at the time, including Professor William Mumma from Tufts University at the time, and Richard Oppenheimer. And on the back side, or that is to say the far side of Jim Hansen in the center, is George Woodwell, hidden by this picture's angle, but to his left, to Jim Hansen's left, is George Woodwell, who just celebrated his 90th birthday and has been the head for years of thinking about global climate change. There were, in fact, other panels also in 1988 focused on climate change and issues of, in fact, what the implications of climate change were going to mean for the greenhouse effect.
But in the same year, in fact, on the 14th of September 1988, there was also a second panel on the greenhouse effect. This was before the Senate Environment and Public Works Subcommittee. And it was quite an impressive array of people that showed up to that. They had it in their usual Senate hearings rooms, and C-SPAN managed to capture, as well as having the testimony itself published. This is back when they used to publish things in printed format, not just online in PDFs, but the joint hearings can be found of the Global Environmental Protection Act of 1988. It's actually an important piece of literature for those studying climate change over the years. And it's very interesting to see who showed up at this panel. It's also a very interesting time to remember in U.S. history. Although Ronald Reagan was president and George H.W. Bush was vice president, the Senate was in fact under the control of the Democrats at the time. And Senator Max Baucus, Democrat from Montana, chaired these subcommittee meetings. But Senator George Mitchell, Democrat from Maine, was also prominent among them. So there was kind of New England voice on this committee as well, and an interest as well. The Republican, Chafee, was also a senator from Rhode Island, another New England senator at the time, and very active as a Republican minority leader of the Senate at the time. Not of the Senate, but of this committee. Now, who showed up to testify? Well, Ralph Cicerone showed up. In a subsequent career, he's become quite prominent, head of the National Academy of Sciences. He was, at the time, at the National Center for Atmospheric Research in Boulder, Colorado. Sherwood Rowland showed up. He's from the Department of Chemistry in the University of California, Irvine, and since he won the Nobel Prize for his work in atmospheric chemistry. In fact, he's the only explicit environmentalist ever to have received the Nobel Prize in Science. Wangari Maathai received the Nobel Peace Prize, and so did Al Gore, the Nobel Peace Prize, for first and only scientist working on climate issues to have received the Nobel Prize in the Sciences was Sherwood Rowland. And Carl Wunsch showed up too in that same committee, panel for the committee, and he has gone on to have a very distinguished career here at MIT in the Atmospheric Sciences Department there. And of course, there was Tim Weiskel as well, showing up, and it was at that committee that it was very clearly made the case that there were solutions to the climate crisis. If you had climate problems, why not fix it? Fix it the way civilizations always have in the past, or suffered when they didn't. And that was the burden of the testimony that Senator Backus asked me to give at the time. It was captured by C-SPAN, so we can look back at the C-SPAN broadcast.
Dr. Weiskel.
I'm trained as an anthropologist.
Doctor, you're going to have to pull that microphone quite a bit closer. This PA system requires microphones that are very close to you.
Enough. I'm trained as an anthropologist, and I was asked to comment on the middle range between years and decades and the last 2 million years in some sense. It's not entirely true that we're facing unprecedented circumstances. While Vice President Bush recently, in respecting the beach pollution this past summer, indicated that 1988 was the year that the environment began to talk back. In reality, the environment has been talking back to man for centuries, indeed millennia. What is striking in retrospect is our seeming inability or our stubborn refusal as a culture, and perhaps even as a species, to hear what it has been saying. The message we should have heard is simple. All civilizations depend ultimately on the ecological viability of their primary productivity, that is, their agricultural base and their forest regeneration. Those cultures whose ecosystems function so as to destroy topsoil, squander fossil water, or deplete plant genetic resources are destined over time to experience either permanent dependence on other cultures or certain and sudden ecological decline on their own.
Well, Tim Weiskel pointed out, in fact, that there's a staggering implication for this if looked at historically. Because historically, we know that civilizations have collapsed on a regular basis when they don't pay attention to the way climate interacts with biogeochemical systems, and particularly biodiversity, fossilized fuel, fossilized water systems, and above all, topsoils.
Well, that was a pretty direct message to the Senate at the time. Certain and sudden ecological decline on their own if they squander their fossilized fuel resources, their fossil water, their plant genetic capacity, and their topsoils. That's the natural capital upon which all civilizations have always been built. And the notion that we're, in some sense, a postmodern culture, don't have to worry about these things, is just not true. There's no such thing as a post-agricultural civilization. Never has been, cannot be. By definition, we need food to eat, right? That's part of an agricultural process. There's no such thing as a post-agricultural civilization. So, if we lose focus on what keeps agriculture viable, that is, plant genetic diversity and the health of the topsoils, there's no hope. This is pointed out clearly to the senators in 1988, and it became then, obviously, the solution as well. If that's the problem, the solution has to do with addressing that.
The environmental archaeology of ancient civilizations makes this dramatically apparent. Agricultural societies of the ancient Near East frequently reached population densities that exceeded the capacity of their land to produce food on a sustainable basis. Problems of overgrazing, watershed deforestation, soil erosion, siltation, waterlogging, soil salinization, and crop blight emerged as the permanent hallmark of these ancient civilizations. The dynamic involved in the rise and fall of ancient societies contained an irreducible ecological component. Since the discovery of the New World, in ecological terms, predatory expansive agriculture and parasitic resource use have characterized European civilization, leading some emergent cultures, such as our own, to believe in the mythology of expanding frontiers. It is important to realize that increases in agricultural output over this period, however, were accounted for not so much by improvements in basic technology as they were simply by the overall expansion of the land surface under cultivation.
Now that's absolutely crucial to understand that, yes, European colonial expansion led to enormous economic growth, but that growth was not the result of improved agricultural technology. It was the result of the expansion of agriculture on vast new topsoils, which in fact were devastated in the process. And it's that devastation that's catching up to us now, very quickly.
While total production rose dramatically in the last 400 years, productivity per acre and productivity per energy unit of input has actually declined. In the modern world, we are the best at producing things at the worst ratios.
Okay, we've become the best at doing the worst of ecosystems. Devastating topsoil, depleting watersheds, drawing up fossil water, as in the Oglala aquifer, when there's no recharge, and all going into a period of dramatic climate change. That makes us all the more vulnerable. We haven't yet absorbed this. Certainly the senators didn't absorb it at the time. And in fact, it's interesting to listen to the full testimony. If you ever get the time, call it up on C-SPAN. It's really quite fascinating reading of the Riot Act, in some sense, to the senators who were bewildered, frankly bewildered. They'd never heard an anthropologist. As Senator Chafee said at the time, we've never had an anthropologist talk to us here. And for that reason, they never heard the message. Well, at the time, they didn't have to hear the message so much as read it, because we not only documented it at the time in that Senate testimony, but in fact wrote it up as a book after the testimony, entitled Environmental Decline in Public Policy, Pattern, Trend, and Prospect. The argument made then, and have made for the 28 years since, is that climate change is not fundamentally an issue of scientific breakthroughs, but rather a major problem of a paradigm shift.
That we need a change in the way we're thinking about these problems, because humans are not dominant in an ecosystem. No species can dominate an ecosystem for long without collapsing it. As Einstein pointed out years ago, we can't solve problems by using the same kind of thinking we used when we created them. And that's the dilemma we're in, because we're trying to solve the environmental problem by assuming that it can be subordinated to human interests. Can't happen, won't happen. You can't optimize any ecosystem for the primary benefit of one of its constituent species. Can't happen, won't happen. All you'll do is increase the efficiency of extinction. And this really isn't the goal.
Well, I went on to the UN and pointed some of these things out. And again, there was a great deal of question and answer at the time. They were bewildered by the fact that there were stated very clearly limits to the human enterprise that are based in biogeochemical processes grounded in topsoil and plant diversity. If you destroy those two things, you're in the process of destroying your own civilization. I made this clear, but there were a lot of questions at the time. Take a look.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm going to go directly to Dr. Weiskell. I think we'll begin with you at your leisure. We're going to start answering those questions. So thank you very much from the audience. If we have time, we'll certainly take some more, or I even might posit a few. So Dr. Weiskell, the floor is yours.
Okay, let me try to recall what was asked here, but basically metrics is a huge issue. UNDP and others have looked into this with different kinds of indexes instead of gross national product, or some of us call it the national gross product. I mean, you should move beyond that. There are genuine development indexes that are out there. There are hundreds of them out there. Economists are working on this. And none of them are approaching the internalization of costs, which gets to this carbon question and the question of how we should price things. That's the whole point of Sir Nicholas Stern. We're facing the fact that we've done cost-benefit analysis and looked only at the benefits, not looked at the costs. The whole carbon bubble, the carbon moment in human history, is one great big gaspillage of a resource with no cost accounted for in terms of its impact on a global functioning ecosystem. If those costs were internalized, you'd be paying $57 a gallon for gas, right? So, yeah, we got to get the metrics straight, but we also just have to move off of carbon. Not because it's becoming more scarce. A few years ago, we used to think, and on one of the graphs I used, it was the peak oil question that was the great anxiety. We're going to run out of the stuff. Well, in fact, we're not going to run out of fossil fuels in any known future, especially with the new technologies used in fracking and the like. It's not the scarcity of the material, it's the impact of the material. We can't survive using that amount of carbon. Just on the post-Columbian city basis. Post-Columbian cities are those that were put in place after Columbus discovered, as it were, the New World. He didn't discover it because it wasn't lost, right? But in any case, the post-Columbian city was put in place pretty much at sea level, because that's how he got here, right? On a boat. The post-Columbian city is under challenge. If you didn't see the graphic here, 1,400 cities in the United States alone. We can't survive in those cities with the combustion of terrestrial carbon. This is why the new movement that's emerging is called the carbon underground. We're trying to keep the carbon underground. And you start doing the metric for that, you measure progress in a very different way. Not how much carbon have you used, but how much have you sequestered? How much have you prevented from being used? Second point about other alternative energies, use the renewable ones. Don't fall into the trap of thinking that nuclear is a solution to anything. If you want to look at externalized costs, think about the tens of thousands of years of the waste products that you have to deal with. We don't even have human languages that have persisted long enough to label the stuff, right? There used to be a department within the DoD, the Department of Defense in the United States, which is actually trying to think of symbol systems to put on nuclear waste dumps so that people would know after a nuclear exchange had occurred to stay away from this material because it was lethal, because the languages wouldn't be around anymore, right? We can't cope with the downstream impact of nuclear, let alone the downstream impact of carbon. So don't think nuclear is a solution in this. What you got to do is run the whole thing on the solar throughput. Now that means water, wind, tidal, micro hydro and the like. That is, hydro is a function of the water cycle, and you're placing yourself back into a solar-driven system.
Alternatives are available and clearly delineated, namely moving to sustainable sources of energy.
See, we've got the thing 180 degrees around. We think we live on a planet with infinite resources and finite energy. We're struggling over to control that finite energy. In fact, in America, it's so absurd. We think that the world doesn't quite get it, That's our oil in the Middle East, right? It's just a geologic mistake it's in the Middle East. But it's our oil. And we spend a few $1 billion a day sort of making sure the world understands that. It's our oil. We're on the wrong metaphor in the sense that it's not infinite energy that we have moved to, and we need to. The infinite throughput of solar energy. We're thinking we've got finite energy and infinite resources, whereas in fact we have finite resources and infinite energy. So this isn't just a slight correction in metric here and there. It's a compass question. Are we going in the right direction? Not, are we becoming more efficient in the direction in which we're going? All you'll do with that is sort of make extinction more efficient, which really isn't the goal. No, you're right. It really isn't the goal to have efficient extinction. We've got to move beyond efficient extinction technologies and re-engage the biogeochemical processes to fix carbon in the system by capturing it through the living plant and healthy topsoils in a system that in effect sequesters carbon in growing topsoils that become richer and richer, provide food for more and more people, and get the carbon out of the atmosphere.
In effect, on Earth, we need to get the carbon out of the atmosphere and sequester it back into its terrestrial storage places. Because this is the only blue planet in the known universe. And it's only in blue planets that you can expect to find life-supporting systems. It's crucial for life as we know it to have water in its liquid state in order for life systems to emerge. They may survive under frozen water systems, and they can be transmitted through cloud systems. But water in its liquid form is the only space, as it were, the only process that allows for the development of organisms with metabolisms that can exchange gases on a regular basis with their environment. We live on the only blue planet in the known universe, and as far as we can tell, it's the only life-supporting planet that we have discovered. In conjunction with plants, as our biological allies, we could accomplish this. That is to say, the sequestration of atmospheric carbon back into the soils on a permanent and expanding basis. But only if we reconceive our role as humans on this finite and fragile planet. Got a carbon problem? Yeah, we sure do. We ought to fix it. We ought to be growing soil to save the human prospect. Those civilizations that did not conserve their soil or learn how to rebuild it collapsed with frightful regularity in the past. They repeated the ecological overshoot and collapse syndrome. It was so frequent that it has to be understood as the drumbeat of human history since the emergence of agriculture. Stability and continuity and sustainability has not been human characterized history since the emergence of agriculture. Overshoot and collapse has been the norm. The reason is simple. It's due to the tragedy that we treat soil like dirt. We don't understand that topsoil, climate change, and the collapse of civilizations is intricately related since the beginning of humans' interactions with plants. The topsoil is in fact very thin on a substrate of rock on the Earth's surface. And anything that rips off the topsoil will diminish the capacity of the Earth to produce food for humans.
Just take the case of agriculture. Humans don't produce food. We can't produce food. The best you and I can do if we go out in the sunlight is get a suntan. And if we stay out there too long, we'll get sunstroke. But we don't photosynthesize. We depend on other organisms that do photosynthesize, right? There's a ratio between the green leaf and the human population. As I say, anybody who thinks that humans can infinitely expand has no idea about how an ecosystem functions. In an ecosystem, all you can do, your best role as a human species, is to learn how to favor the environment for plants to grow. In other words, you can produce topsoil. Topsoil produces food. And if you're lucky, you can get enough of that back to you to keep going. But if you're not producing topsoil, if in fact you're doing what every country and every continent, in every culture is doing at this point, destroying topsoil, you're on the wrong side of the evolutionary trip here. And your journey won't be long.
Throughout all of recorded history, the decline of civilization comes rapidly. The journey toward collapse is not long. This is why we need to look at the transformations of the food systems that we are in the midst of. And we need to think about making a paradigm shift. There's no such thing as a post-agricultural civilization. Can't happen, won't happen. The reason is simple. We need to eat food to live. No civilization can live if its human population collapses. So, we need to realize that agriculture is crucial to civilization and cannot be reduced to a mechanical industrial process. Can't happen, won't happen. It's firmly embedded in sustainable ecosystems. The crucial question is whether humankind can now embrace the paradigm shift away from agriculture as an industry toward a permanent agriculture embedded in a solar sustainable ecosystem. The fatal consequences of a misplaced metaphor, the agricultural industry, is part of the delusion of infinite growth in a finite ecosystem. We have to move away from that kind of modeling done by the richest man on earth and those that deal with agriculture as if it were an industry. It's not. It's a subset of biogeochemical systems in a finite ecosystem.